On to the next topic, long-term memory, and this corresponds to chapter 6 in the textbook. So long-term memory is anything from 30 seconds up to 90 years. As we said, short-term memory lasts up to 15 seconds, maximum is potentially 30 seconds. Anything beyond that would technically be considered long-term memory. So short-term memory and long-term memory interact, and this is a picture from the textbook. What you're seeing here is somebody's having a conversation, and they're engaging in short-term memory in terms of processing the specific information that somebody's currently saying to him, but engaging long-term memory in terms of thinking about the meaning and further elaborating on that information in short-term memory. So they are connected. There's bidirectional flow between short-term memory and long-term memory. Something you can maybe pull stuff from long-term memory, think about it in short-term memory, and something in short-term memory may cause you to retrieve something from long-term memory. What's the difference between short-term memory and long-term memory? Well, short-term memory is encoded in terms of the physical characteristics of the input. So it's much more specific to the particular way in which the information was conveyed to you. You can remember specific words. You can repeat an entire sentence. You may remember the intonation. You may remember visual characteristics of information you saw, whereas long-term memory is abstracted away from this to the meaning of the input. And we saw an example of that from listening from the case of a story. So everybody knows the story of Little Red Riding Hood and maybe remembers a lot of the same details. But in terms of remembering the specific words that were used to convey this story to you whenever you first heard it, typically the information, you're not going to have that information. What you do is you retain something that's abstracted away from that retains the basic meaning of that information without recalling the specific physical structure of the sensory information that first conveyed that to you. So what information is there? That there are two types of memory, and we talked about neuropsychological data. There are patients who have very severe anterograde amnesia, Clive Waring patient and HM, Jimmy G, who's discussed in your textbook. And in the case of severe anterograde amnesia, these patients will often show complete inability to form new long-term memories. However, we watched a video of Clive Waring, so it was a very profound form of anterograde amnesia. Also has some retrograde amnesia, but complete and total anterograde amnesia, inability to form long-term memories. 1 minute after he has an experience, he completely forgets he had it. But if you look at these patients, they often have perfectly functional working memory or short-term memory. So they can remember a list of words for up to 30 seconds. And that, of course, is a form of information. They're learning new information, and yet they're able to learn that information and recall it. And so short-term memory is functional, but long-term memory is extremely impaired. And this suggests that these may depend, again, on separate kinds of brain systems and separate cognitive structures. What about the other way around? Can you have intact long-term memory and then depleted short-term memory? And the answer is there are some examples of that. Patient KF had very severe short-term memory deficits, but was able to remember long-term memory episodes from way back in her life. And as we mentioned, Alzheimer's disease also has a characteristic that you can see some depletion of short-term memory capacity even before any deficits in long-term memory are apparent. Much of the research on long-term memory, as we mentioned, has the characteristics that it uses word lists as the procedure by which memory is tested. And as we'll see later in this review and later in the semester, it's not the only kind of memory that exists. There's also things like episodic memory, implicit memory. But much of the research on long-term memory has used this kind of explicit recall of specific word lists. So we know that there's encoding, storage, and retrieval, and the question is, what determines what makes it into long-term memory? So a very important component of what makes it into long-term memory is attention. And we can see this in Broadbent's filter model. As we know, in the simple early filtering model of Broadbent, only information that makes it through the filter gets processed in terms of its meaning. And as we said, meaning, and so the detector in this model is processing meaning, and we said meaning is the means by which information is encoded in long-term memory. And that's what gets sent to memory, is the meaning. And so if you don't have attention, then that information's meaning doesn't get processed or as processed. and therefore it's much less likely to make it into long-term memory. And we discussed a study briefly that showed exactly that. People who are engaged in a different selective attention task, any items that are unattended end up not making it into long-term memory. What else determines what's encoded? So attention is one thing. What else might be a factor in terms of encoding long-term memory? So we discussed the serial position effect, which is when people have to learn a long list of words, there's often a U-shaped function in terms of when they heard the word and how well they remember it. So there's a primacy effect. Words early on in the list are remembered fairly well. Words towards the end of the list are remembered the best, and words in the middle of the list are remembered more poorly. So the recency effect is usually attributed to primacy at the words at the beginning of the list, and recency at words at the end of the list are better remembered. So why? Well, recency is usually thought of as being because information is still in short-term memory. That's why you remember that. Primacy, on the other hand, is thought to be because you have time to rehearse those words because they're early on in the list, and throughout the rest of the experiment you have some time to keep them in your mind, and those end up making it into long-term memory. And so this suggests, and as we said, we look at the Atkinson and Schiffer model, has this rehearsal, which is a control process, and that also may lead to the information being stored in long-term memory. So just repeating information can facilitate that information making it into long-term memory. However, as we said, pure exposure is not sufficient. You can see a penny many, many times in your life, but if you don't pay attention to the details, just pure exposure, just repetition, doesn't actually lead to very rich and well-remembered encoding. So people will often forget key details, which way Lincoln is facing, where the date goes, despite lots of repetitions. So what else might account for what makes it into long-term memory? And an important theory is Craig and Lockhart's level of processing theory, that the more deeply you encode something, the better you remember it. And so Craig and Tulving did some studies seminal studies that showed that there are differences in how well you remember information based on how you encode it initially. So subjects had to answer different kinds of questions about lists of words, and we did this as an in-class experiment, and they had to either respond to whether the letters were uppercase or lowercase, whether the word rhymes with a different word, or whether the word fits in a sentence. And the point is that this is a very superficial, the case is a very superficial form of encoding. Rhyme requires that you at least figure out what the word is, but not necessarily its meaning, and then the sentence requires meaning. And the overall findings are that the worst performance is in the most superficial form, which is the case. Performance is better in the rhyming case, the rhyming condition, when you have to encode it in terms of the sound of the word. And the best performance by far is when you have to encode it in terms of the meaning of the word. So deeper processing leads to better memory for these words. Another thing to note here is that the yes cases tend to outperform the no cases. So when the word does rhyme versus when it doesn't, when the word does fit in the sentence versus when it doesn't. And the idea is that to the extent that you're processing that information, you're processing it more fully when it's a positive response versus a negative response. So when the word fits, this leads to a richer encoding, and when it fits into the sentence, it leads to a richer encoding when it's embedded in a sentence that within which it makes sense. However, there's additional research that suggests that it's not all about encoding. So you can initially encode something, and as we know, memories consist of three processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And if you're not able to retrieve that information, then your memory isn't worth very much. So there's the idea of a queue, that sometimes we need a queue in order to retrieve information. Somehow we need some way, some index that will dig up that memory and pull it out of storage. And what Morris found was this idea of transfer appropriate processing, that the ability, the quality of memory isn't only dependent on whether you encoded something deeply or not. It can depend on whether the retrieval queue matches the way in which you learned it. So what Morris did was have people, it's very similar to the Craig and Tulving, had people learn word lists either where they had to process the meaning of the word, or they had to do some sort of rhyming test. Does it rhyme with goat? Or does the blank dove off the diving board? And then you have to decide whether that fits. And so according to levels of processing, we would expect that the meaning would lead to the best memory. However, what Morris did was during the test, he asked people to remember the words in different ways. Subjects had to either perform a standard recall task or they had to do a rhyming recall task. What rhymed with simmer? And what they found was, what Morris found was that if the initial word had been encoded in terms of its sound, so in the rhyming task, then now if they had to remember it based on a rhyme, based on whether it rhymed with, say, simmer, they were better at it when they had encoded it in terms of the rhyming versus when they had encoded it in terms of the meaning. So it's not as simple as simply saying that no matter what, if you learn the words in terms of their meaning, that's definitely going to lead to better memory. It also depends on the nature of the retrieval cue. So the way in which something may jog a memory, something may cause you to remember something, depending on what that cause is, depending on the nature of the retrieval cue, that can change your ability to remember something or not. However, one important point here is that in a standard recall task, semantic wins. Generally speaking, if all things being equal, it's better to encode information in terms of the semantic meaning if there's no specific retrieval cue that has to do with something else that doesn't have to do with the meaning. So implications for studying, for instance, you probably shouldn't try rhyming the words that you're learning, the terms that you're trying to learn. Much better off learning the meaning of those words and encoding it more deeply. Another example of retrieval cues being important is Tulving and Pearlstone. They found that if people learned words that came from certain categories, so let's say people learned a list of words made up of the categories birds, furniture, a bunch of different categories, but people weren't told when they were learning them that they were made up of these categories. Then later on, they had people either just recall the words, tell me all the words you remember from the list, or they told people there were 3 categories of words. Now can you list them? And people did much better when they were given the categories, and that's because those categories serve as retrieval cues. Oh, it was a bird. Now I remember I saw an ostrich or a penguin. And so given that retrieval cue, that helps people to remember. And this is, again, a very familiar idea that when somebody gives you some sort of hook or a cue, that can help you to retrieve memory. As we've said, this is kind of intuitive, but there are less intuitive examples of retrieval cues where it's not an obvious logical connection between the retrieval cue and the items that you have to remember. So, for instance, there's this idea that where one learns the information, the situation in which one learns the information can serve as a retrieval cue. In this particular example, the 1975 diving experiment, participants learned words either underwater or on land. And then they were tested either underwater and on land. And the basic results were that people who studied the list underwater remembered it better when they were later tested underwater than when they were tested on land. And the opposite was true as well. For those who learned it on land, they were better at remembering it when they were on land versus when they had to remember it underwater. So even though the cue is irrelevant, being underwater had nothing to do with the word list. It's the exact same word list. Just being in the same situation allowed people to remember better. Same thing, later study, even something distracting like a noise. But if you're learning information with noise, and then it's better, people remember better when they're later tested with noise than quiet, and vice versa. And even one's emotional state. So if people are given emotionally arousing words, making them happy or sad during their study, if they're sad when they're learning the word list, they're better at remembering it when they're sad versus when they're happy, and vice versa. So the bottom line is just about anything that can have that can match between when people are encoding the information and then when they have to retrieve the information. The better the match, the better memory performance is generally going to be. So bottom line, any similarity between learning and retrieval helps. At least there's a long list of these kinds of studies that show these kinds of matching between encoding and retrieval can facilitate performance. 12 is the last lecture on to be covered for this exam, and this should correspond to mostly to chapter 7 in the textbook. So we talked about the fact that there's different kinds of memory that can be carved up, short-term memory and long-term memory, which we already discussed. And in addition, long-term memory can also be explicit and implicit. So we mentioned a lot of studies are done with word lists, which is explicit. But implicit can also take place, unconscious kinds of memory, things like priming, procedural memory. So that's the ability to know how to do something physically. Priming is this short-lived response where some stimulus you just saw a moment ago can direct your behavior there soon thereafter. And explicit memory can be further divided into episodic memory and semantic memory, and we're going to go through these. So explicit and declarative memory are facts about the world that people can actually report. And there's two kinds. There's episodic memory, which involves this mental time travel. You can relive things in the order in which they took place. And that's a very important characteristic of episodic memory, where semantic memory has none of that autobiographical kinds of experience. It's simply a fact that you know. You may not even remember where you learned it. So there's evidence that these are actually, in fact, different kinds of memory from the kinds of dissociations we've talked about in relation to other kinds of cognitive functions. So we have patients who, like Casey, who have damaged hippocampus, and in this case, their semantic memory is intact, but his or her episodic memory is not present. So this patient can't describe reliving an experience, but does know facts from his or her past. And then the Italian woman is the opposite, and so this is a double dissociation. Is able to relive memories for her past, but is missing large chunks of semantic memory. In addition, in terms of brain scans, there is fMRI evidence that these are carried by different parts of the brain. So if subjects are listening to recordings and thinking about autobiographical events or semantic facts. So in this case, they're doing two different types of tasks. Either they're just thinking about semantic facts, things like these are just facts about the world, or listening to themselves recorded talking about autobiographical events. So this is where they're just thinking about or listening to them events that have taken place in their life, and then they're recorded from the brain and measured where there's differential activity. And as you can see in the yellow, we have autobiographical kinds of memory. So this is episodic memory where they're reliving. Oh, I'm sorry. The blue is where they're reliving the events from their past, as opposed to just hearing facts about the world, semantic memory. And one thing to note is the blue and the autobiographical memory seems to be concentrated in what we think of as sensory areas. So it's reactivating those sensory areas as somebody's reliving those experiences. Both episodic and semantic memories are usually encoded initially when somebody has an experience. So if you're having a conversation with somebody and they're giving you some information, sometime after that, you're very likely to have an episodic memory. You may remember and be able to relive and have that mental time travel about the experience that you had. But over time, typically the episodic memory will be lost. It's a more fragile, more fleeting kind of memory. And only the semantic information may be left. So you may remember the facts, the information from a conversation or an event that took place, but you may not be able to go back and remember the exact situation, the context, the source, what kind of person you were talking to. You may just remember the facts themselves, and all that's left is semantic memory. In addition to these forms of what we call explicit or declarative memory, we have non-declarative implicit memory, and we already mentioned there's a couple of different categories of this. Procedural memories, things like riding a bike, and associative learning, and we discussed these three different types of associative learning, implicit memory based on associative learning. This is where you have some association between something, some experience, and some sort of object or category. And this can play out and carry over to one's behavior even if one doesn't remember having those experiences. And so we're going to talk about some particular examples. Priming is an example of an implicit memory. And what happens in priming is somebody can be exposed to a list of words or a word or whatever the case may be. And soon thereafter, if one is then tested in a certain way, you can show that sometimes there's an effect of having been exposed to those words, even if one doesn't remember having seen those words. So, for instance, in a famous study by Tulving, subjects learned word lists and had to do a fill-in-the-blanks task, and they were better at filling in the blanks even when they couldn't recall the word. So if they were given a recall test, they may not remember that they saw the word pardon, but then if given a fill-in-the-blanks test, they may be better at filling in those blanks, and they may do it more quickly than somebody who hadn't seen that word list, even though they weren't able to recall it. So it's implicit because they have no explicit memory. They don't recall having seen it, but it's affecting in this case, their ability to do this task. Generally, there's a short-term effect. Priming lasts somewhere in the range of minutes. It does not last for hours or days. And in order to see that this is a distinct type of memory from explicit memory, that implicit seems to be quite distinct, um, we can look again in the neuropsychological data, and amnesia patients who may have severe interrograde amnesia. And so, for instance, in a free recall task where they're shown a list of words or they're shown pictures, may not have any ability to remember explicitly what information they saw. And so if you ask them to just free recall the list, tell me what you saw, they may have no idea. They may not even remember that they saw the list. But in a word completion task, like the one we just talked about, they may have just as much benefit as somebody without amnesia from the fact that they saw the list before. So the fact that they saw the word pardon before may actually facilitate their ability to fill in the blanks and say the word pardon now. And that suggests that their implicit memory can remain intact even if their explicit memory is not. And again, this carries over not just amnesia patients. The assumption is that in non-amnesia patients, in regular individuals, these memory systems might be separable because of this kind of dissociation. Another example of this kind of implicit memory in amnesia patients, and this is a object recognition task. So here, what's different about this task and the others, besides being that it's a visual recognition task, is that in this case they were able to show, Warrington and Weisenkranz showed that over days of training, these amnesia patients' abilities improved, and so that they were able to. So they were shown these pictures of the airplane. And over days of training, they were able to recognize the airplane at lower and lower levels of information. So they were able to recognize it, say, originally maybe at D, and then over time they were able to recognize it C and B, and so on and so forth. Even though they would have no explicit memory, if you asked them what they had seen pictures of, they would have no idea. Another example of implicit memory is prejudice. And so that's the fact that people have subjective kind of judgments of things, often based on previous experience, even if one does not remember that previous experience. Some examples of this kind of prejudice in research contexts are things like the fact that repetition can lead to people judging things more favorably, such as advertisements. Even if one does not remember having seen an advertisement before, often that will lead to that advertisement being viewed more favorably. And this is not going to just be for advertisements. So it could be for anything, a product, an object, even a person, perhaps that one has some familiarity with. Even if one doesn't remember having seen that person, it's still going to boost that subjective positivity. Propaganda effect is yet another example of this. So it's just a particularly salient example, a compelling example, because what Begedal showed was that even if people were told that a sentence was false, but then later on were tested on whether they thought that sentence was true or not, the fact that they heard the sentence before made them more likely to say it was true, even if they were explicitly told it was false during encoding. Unless they specifically remember that information that it was told they were false, just having heard the sentence before made them more likely to rate it as true. And so again, this suggests the power of just repeating information, and it tends to make things more believable to people. And we also discussed the IAT, which is one of the COG labs, one of the homework assignments. And what the basic findings of the IAT are is that there are behavioral, systematic behavioral slowdown in behavioral responses when somebody has to pair a certain physical response, like a left side button press or a right side button press, with something positive and something that is thought to be potentially they have a bias towards. So, for instance, in the case we discussed, there's a lot of evidence that people engaging in this task with somebody where they have to judge something as positive and somebody from a different race using the same response, this seems to lead to conflict in the response. It leads to longer response times than when they have to do something that's, say, negative and that other race. And this suggests, and many people have taken this to mean, that people carry around implicit biases, that these information conflicts. And importantly, this is true even for people who say that they have no such biases. And it's not that we don't believe that they don't have such that they don't. It's not that we think that they're lying that they don't have such biases, but rather the idea is that perhaps such biases are implicit, that people can be even unaware that they have them, but they can be based on previous exposure to information, and in this case, it's a form of implicit memory. It's based on something perhaps that you don't remember. Maybe you were exposed to certain kinds of associations, and those can carry forth in terms of the behavioral response. And then the question is, does this extend to other kinds of behavioral responses besides button pressings? And as I said, this is something of a controversy. And this was an example of the implicit association task. So you have to respond to, say, a black name or a white name using left hand or right hand. And then you also associate pleasant versus unpleasant to a word with the left hand or right hand. And the critical finding is that, let's say, so white people might have a tendency that if they have to respond to both black and pleasant using the left hand, that may take them longer than have to respond to both white and pleasant using the left hand. And again, this is not about necessarily, it may seem this is about confusion or so on and so forth, but if done properly with appropriate counterbalancing, so half participants will get one order and half the other participants will get the other order, you still see a systematic slowdown when people have to make these kinds of responses, where it's a pairing that is prone to this kind of bias. Procedural memory is skill memory, and the famous fact about skill memory is that it's typically not subject to forgetting. And this is an ability to do this, again, without explicit awareness of how one does it. And it's resistant to forgetting, even in patients like HM, were able to develop new skills, such as mirror drawing. And so procedural memory seems to be, again, dependent on an implicit memory system that isn't as subject to forgetting as explicit memory is. Another form of implicit memory is classical conditioning, and a very particularly strong version of this is phobias, which are thought to often be due to some sort of early experience with something, a negative experience, for instance, with some particular category. And the idea is one can have the fear without having the memory of the original event that took place. And so again, this would be a form of implicit memory because it has behavioral ramifications based on some past experience, but one need not remember the past experience. Finally, we discussed long-term memory and the brain, how long-term memory is encoded in the brain. So one thing we talked about is long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation are changes in the synapse. So the synapse is that gap between synaptic cleft between an ascending neuron releasing neurotransmitters and receiving neuron. And the idea is that with increased exposure to something, these can change. There are structural changes, perhaps more neurotransmitter release from the ascending neuron or more receptors from the receiving neuron. And so this leads to a more active, so now you need just a little bit of stimulation and it gets it going because you already primed, the neurons are sort of already primed to respond in this way. Within the brain, there's certain brain areas that are known to be very involved with memory. Of course, we already talked about a hippocampus, and without hippocampus, we know from HM that no new long-term memories can be formed. The hippocampus is part of this medial temporal lobe structure, and there are a bunch of structures. We didn't really go into any detail in the medial temporal lobe that are involved in memory formation. The last thing we talked about was memory consolidation. And this is the idea that memories begin as being fragile and then are consolidated into a more stable form in long-term memory. So even if something makes it into long-term memory, we're not talking about short-term memory, we're talking about long-term memory, 5 minutes, 10 minutes later. Even if it's 10 minutes later, although it's in the long-term memory range, it still can be a very fragile memory and may not make it and become a more permanent fiber memory. And we talked about two ways that consolidation takes place, synaptic and system consolidation. So synaptic consolidation, this figure should look familiar. Hopefully it's in your long-term memory. And so this is just this long-term potentiation. These changes at the synapse are a form of consolidation. And the point is that this takes place in minutes from an event. These are things that happen very quickly. And so long-term memory is formed in just a few minutes in terms of structural changes at the synapse. a more solid form of consolidation that can last for a lot longer, for perhaps a lifetime, is systems consolidation. And this is where the hippocampus goes and coordinates activity within the cortex, and it sort of offloads the memory from the hippocampus into the cortex and then reprograms the cortex to hold that memory. And once it's in the cortex, it can last for a lot longer. And this type of consolidation doesn't happen in minutes, it happens over days, months, or even years. And the evidence for that comes from cases where this kind of process can be disturbed. So, for instance, if somebody sustains a head injury, what you'll see is temporally graded retrograde amnesia. So, what happens in this case is that the closer one gets to the point of diagnosis, the less memory that person will have of events that took place beforehand. So, if somebody has a car accident, for instance, they often will forget almost all the information immediately before that car accident, and quite a bit of the information from earlier in the day. And then, as one goes back in time, if it's unfortunately a very serious accident, then the retrograde amnesia could go back decades. And what you'll see is it's graded. So the further away you get from the event, the better the memory may be. And why is that? And the suggestion is that because that memory has been further and further consolidated over a lifetime, our memory continues to get consolidated, and it becomes more and more stable and permanent. So this type of head injury can lead to a disruption of this consolidation, and that's why you see this kind of graded retrograde amnesia. Things that are not yet consolidated are now getting disrupted.